We're going to look now at different metrics we use when we're assessing populations between countries and in a country, and different metrics that can give us an idea, perhaps, of how developed or less developed a country is or how healthy their population is. So one of the first things that we look at are the crude birth rates and the crude death rates. And anytime we're talking about a rate, it's not just a straight up number. We're looking at a number per 1,000 people or per something else. So the crude birth rate is the number of births per 1,000 people in a population, and the crude death rate is the number of deaths per 1,000 people in a population. So this can give us an idea of whether a population is growing or not if we know these numbers. But they can be a little misleading because if you have a crude death rate, it may be because you have a large elderly population, very old people, a lot of old people in your country, so you're going to expect to see greater death rate. And similarly, if you have a crude birth rate, it could be because you have a really young population in the country, and so you would expect to see perhaps a higher crude birth rate. The annual growth rate is found simply by subtracting the crude death rate from the crude birth rate, which gives you the growth rate of the people who are living in the country at the time. But again, it can be a little misleading depending on what the population structure of that country is. So to get away from that, you can look at age-specific birth rates. And this is where you're looking at the number of births per 1,000 women, but you're specifying the years that you're looking at. So you may have only looking at women who are from 20 to 40 years old, and what is the birth rate in that group of women, and that is a better statistic that you can compare across countries and across different populations. By knowing the crude birth rate and death rate, we can find the natural increase rate of a country. So this is how much the population is either going up or going down based on how many people are being born and how many people are dying. So you get some idea of whether a population is increasing or decreasing. But what this doesn't tell us is how many people are immigrating, coming into that country, how many people are emigrating, leaving that country. So merely by knowing the natural increase rate, we're still not necessarily going to get an accurate idea of whether that population is growing or shrinking because it's not taking into account immigration. A statistic that we look at a lot and that we talk about a lot in this unit, and it's important that you know, is total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the average number of births babies a woman has over her childbearing years, and generally statisticians look at childbearing years as 15 to 44. This is a really important number because by looking at total fertility rate, we can assess whether a population is replacing itself or whether it's growing or whether it's shrinking. But the total fertility rate depends on how developed a country is. So for example, in a more developed country, say the United States, merely to replace the population, to keep the population exactly the same, women have about 2.1. A woman has on average about 2.1 babies. That's the total fertility rate. And that will keep the population where it is. Again, not including immigration. But in a less developed country, the total fertility rate may be higher. Perhaps it's 2.7, perhaps it's 3. And that's because there may not be good health care there. There may not be good health care for mothers, for babies, for children, so you'll have a higher child mortality rate. And women, merely to replace the population, have to have more babies. But total fertility rate, when we are going to look at this, gives you a very good idea about a country's level of development. So in some countries, we know, like Japan, the total fertility rate is 1.7. That means that the native-born Japanese are not replacing the population, that population may shrink over time. And if your total fertility rate is high, if it's 4 or 5, your population is growing over time. Two other important metrics we look at to assess the status of a country, its health status, the well-being of its people, even its level of development, are infant mortality rate and child mortality rate. And infant mortality rate is the number of deaths in children under the age of 1, so these are babies, per 1,000 live births. And child mortality rate encompasses that. It's the probability, the number of deaths of a child before the age of 5 per 1,000 births. And if there is a country that has a very high infant or child mortality rate, then that tells us that that country does not have particularly good health care, doesn't have good prenatal care for pregnant women, that it probably is going to be a less developed country. And indeed, if we look at this map of infant mortality rate, and the higher figures are the orange countries, the dark and the regular orange countries, those are going to be usually less developed countries where women aren't getting access to good health care and babies aren't necessarily being vaccinated. Now, if we look at more developed countries in this list, we see that U.S. infant mortality is actually not so great. We are at the bottom of the list here of more developed countries. And why is that? We know that we have relatively good health care, we have great hospitals. Why would we have high infant mortality rates? Well, one reason is that when calculating infant mortality, different countries actually go about calculating it differently. So in the United States, for example, if a woman is pregnant and she's 5 months pregnant and loses that baby, that counts as a death, as an infant mortality death. But in another country, they may not count that as an infant mortality death. So that is part of the reason why we have higher infant mortality rates compared to other developed countries, but it's not the entirety of the reason. It's also because we have certain subpopulations in the United States of women who have very high infant mortality rates. And in particular, it's women of color, Black women, and less educated women. So those two groups have much higher infant mortality rates than in other countries, and that's bringing us down in these rankings of developed countries. So we can see that in this chart here. So white mothers have an infant mortality rate of 4.67, while Black mothers have 10.97, so more than twice as high. And Native American mothers also have a very high infant mortality rate. This next slide shows us the additional sort of socioeconomic component of this. So white high school dropouts, so less educated white mothers who don't necessarily have good access to prenatal care, don't have good health care themselves, have a very high infant mortality rate of 9.9 compared to white college grad mothers at 3.7. But Black college grads, so highly educated Black mothers, still have a very high infant mortality rate. Again, 3 times as much as white mothers, college grad mothers. And they've speculated that one of the reasons for this is because of the racism and the stress induced by racism that Black women encounter throughout their lives. And so if they are under stress all the time and their bodies are at stress, when you add in being pregnant and the stress on your body from that, it's almost too much. The system sort of shuts down and it contributes to this high infant mortality rate. So when we're thinking about all these statistics and metrics, they're tools that we use or little indicators we can use to think about the populations and countries, to think about levels of development and varying levels of development, to think about which populations in a country are better off or worse off, which populations between countries are. And all of these metrics can give us a window into what's going on and what are success stories and perhaps failures and things to work on in different countries.